Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining for this chronologically the third of our 2025 lecture series lectures. My name is Joseph Cronin. I'm the director of the Leo Baeck Institute London, and our annual lecture series, of which this is a part, is hosted in collaboration with the German Historical Institute London, and I'm delighted that Dr. Michael Scheich is here this evening representing the GHIL. Without further ado, it's a great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Erin Hochman, Associate Professor of History at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. Dr. Hochman is a specialist in modern German and Austrian history with a particular focus on nationalism, democracy, and political culture in the interwar period. She earned her PhD from the University of Toronto in 2010, following undergraduate studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Her award-winning first book, Imagining a Greater Germany, Republican Nationalism and the Idea of Anschluss, published by Cornell University Press, received both the Hans Rosenberg Prize and the Radomir Lutzer Prize. She's also written widely on the politics of nationhood and democracy in the Weimar and First Austrian republics, contributing chapters and articles to leading journals and edited volumes, including the Oxford Handbook of the Weimar Republic. Dr. Hochman is currently working on a new book, Germany Unbound, The Politics of German Diaspora in the Weimar Republic and the Third Reich, which explores how ideas of Germanness extended beyond the nation's borders. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Erin Hochman.
Great, thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone for joining me today. And of course, I'd also like to thank the Leo Baeck Institute London for inviting me to share my work. And in particular, I'd like to extend my thanks to Joe and Karina for organizing today's talk. So I'm just going to share my screen. And let me get the slideshow going here. Okay, so I want to begin today's talk with an anecdote from the interwar period. So two paramilitary groups, one from Germany and one from Austria, decided to hold a joint celebration. The festivities began with a torchlight parade that ended with the symbolic burning of the boundary post between Germany and Austria, which you can see illustrated here. As the post landed on the pyre, a roar of approval emanated from the 12,000 torchbearers. 2 days later, following a parade of over 100,000 Reich Germans and Austrians, prominent politicians assembled in a theater to highlight the meaning of these festivities. To the cheers of the audience, 3 Reich German speakers expressed their firm desire for an Anschluss, or the unification of Germany and Austria. The final speaker at the ceremony hailed from Austria. In a speech that received thundering applause, he announced, quote, "For us Germans in Austria, a powerful impulse prevails to return once again to the Reich," end quote. Now, at first glance, we might associate such symbolism and proclamations with Nazi propaganda. After all, the Nazis are known for their orchestration of mass rallies and their relentless determination to expand Germany's boundaries. In particular, the celebrations that I just described might conjure up images of the Anschluss in 1938, when Adolf Hitler annexed his native country to the Third Reich. On that occasion, numerous Austrians joyously greeted the arrival of the German army and immediately set out to humiliate, harass, and persecute their Jewish neighbors. Now, given the resemblance between these two events, the torchlight parade and the ceremony of the paramilitary groups appear to embody the type of aggressive and racist nationalism associated with the Nazis and Germany more generally. However, as I've shown in my research, such assumptions overlook the complexities surrounding German nationalism and the struggle for political legitimacy in interwar Central Europe. The festivities that I've just described, for instance, included not a single Nazi. They actually took place in 1925 on the occasion of the one-year anniversary of the Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot Gold, the German Veterans Association created to defend the Weimar Republic. The three speakers from the Reich calling for an Anschluss represented each of the parties involved in the Reichsbanner. So Reichstag President Paul Löbe, a member of the German Social Democratic Party, or the SPD, former Chancellor Josef Wirth, a member of the Catholic Center Party, and Reichstag delegate Ludwig Haas, a member of the left liberal German Democratic Party, or DDP, and a leading figure in the Central Association of German Citizens of Jewish Faith. Joining the Reich Germans in this demonstration was a small contingent of the Republikanischer Schutzbund, the paramilitary arm of the Austrian Social Democratic Party. The Austrian speaker was the head of this defensive formation, Julius Deutsch, who was also a target of anti-Semitic attacks due to the fact that he was born in Hungary to a Jewish family, although he himself did not practice Judaism. These Republicans, which was a term used by members of the Weimar coalition parties and the Austrian Social Democrats at the time to describe themselves, envisioned a far different outcome to an Austro-German political union than the Nazis. An Anschluss would create, as Julius Deutsch proclaimed, quote, a single unified German folk in a German republic, end quote. Not only did the political basis and territorial scope of a Republican Greater Germany, or Großdeutschland, significantly contrast with Nazi notions about race and space, but so too did their definitions of a German nation, or folk. As the backgrounds of the participants in this celebration suggest, Republicans embraced socialists and Jews, groups whose Germanness was hotly contested by the political right, as members of a German national community. This example shows that we need to move beyond simply viewing German nationalism and the interwar political experiment through the lens of the horrors of the Third Reich. German nationalism did not, as one scholar has maintained, inherently harbor, quote, the possibility of the final solution, end quote, nor were the Nazis destined to seize power in the bitter aftermath of the First World War. Republicans in both countries worked hard to popularize the infant republics by staging mass rallies and by creating their own form of German nationalism, one that stood in direct opposition to the exclusionary and violent nationalisms of the political right. To do so, they used the großdeutsch idea, or the Greater German idea, that Germany should include Austria. By basing their distinctive vision of nationhood on the großdeutsch idea, Republicans in both countries sought to refute the political right's claims that Germany and democracy, internationalism and nationalism, and Jew and German were mutually exclusive categories. These efforts thus illustrate that the political right could not lay sole claim to the national movement, that the Anschluss movement should not be coded solely as a Nazi project, and that democracy had enthusiastic supporters in both countries after the First World War. So let's start with the question of why the großdeutsch idea. Why did Republicans in both countries view the großdeutsch idea as critical to crafting their own distinctive version of German nationalism? Well, the großdeutsch idea was important because it enabled Republicans to craft historical narratives that helped them refute the political right's claims that the Weimar and First Austrian republics were foreign impositions or the result of a stab in the back during the war. In numerous publications and speeches, Republicans in both countries argued that the großdeutsch idea was the cornerstone of the historic efforts to achieve German national unity in the 19th century. In particular, they focused their histories on the Frankfurt Parliament of 1848 to 49 because it included Austrian representatives and sought to create a German nation state with a parliamentary basis. Now, you might wonder, why would Republicans choose to highlight the events of 1848, given that the revolution did not succeed? However, the failure of the Frankfurt Parliament actually strengthened their case, allowing them to contend that only a democratic republic could achieve a Großdeutschland. As Philipp Scheidemann, the very man who had proclaimed the German Republic in 1918, explained at an Anschluss rally held by the Reichsbanner in 1926, quote, in 1848, German democracy attempted to create Greater Germany. Reactionary forces destroyed these plans in 1866, end quote. Here we can see how Republicans used the Frankfurt Parliament in order to argue that a democratic form of government was an integral part of German national history. Republicans asserted that it was a democratic body that had first attempted to create a German nation state and a German nation state that included Austria. Moreover, this quote shows us another important argument made by Republicans. As the reference to the Austro-Prussian War of 1866 indicates, they insisted that it was the rivalry between the Habsburg and Hohenzollern monarchies that had prevented German speakers in Central Europe from realizing their dream of a united German state in the mid-19th century. Furthermore, this dynastic enmity meant that Bismarck's so-called unification of Germany had been far from complete. They therefore claimed that only a democratic government could fully achieve German national unity, because a representative government placed national interest above particularistic ones. In their eyes, the new democratic republics were consequently more German than the monarchies so vaunted by their conservative opponents. Indeed, Republicans claim that the post-war political system was part of this national tradition dating back to 1848. As Bernhard Falk, who was a judicial counselor, a member of the German Democratic Party, and was also Jewish, pithily explained, quote, the Weimar Constitution returns to the old großdeutsch idea, end quote. And here, of course, you can see, right, the Reichsbanner for its 1928 celebration of the Weimar Constitution is also a recognition of the 80th anniversary of the Frankfurt Parliament. Yet Republicans did not simply focus on the past or even the present to substantiate their national sentiments. They also looked to the future by calling for an Anschluss. Although many on the political right demanded a union of the two countries as well, Republicans were quick to differentiate themselves from their opponents. They categorically rejected aggressive expansionism that would jeopardize the sovereignty of neighboring countries. While they did express concern about the fate of German speakers in places like South Tyrol and Upper Silesia, they specifically said that they did not want the quote-unquote colonization of the East. An Anschluss in their eyes was simply a matter of self-determination. As the Arbeiterzeitung, the main socialist newspaper in Austria, explained, quote, we recognize the right to self-determination of the other nations of the Habsburg monarchy and simply ask for the same right for the German folk, end quote. After all, contemporaries estimated that over 90% of Austrians at the time wished to join Germany. And to drive this point home, Paul Löbe, again, president of the Reichstag for most of the Weimar Republic and a member of the German Social Democrats, explained the true supporters of the Anschluss idea were, quote, the parties on the left, the supporters of the League of Nations, the friends of peace, end quote. As Löbe's reference to the League of Nations and peace suggests, Republicans did not see their national and internationalist sentiments as conflicting. Unlike the radical right, Republicans sought to achieve an Anschluss by working through the League of Nations. The peace treaties actually allowed that an Austro-German union could occur with the approval of the Council of the League of Nations. By peacefully creating a larger political and economic unit in the heart of Europe, Republicans also maintained that they would start to help the process of creating a quote-unquote United States of Europe. Despite calling for a revision of Germany's boundaries, Republicans were thus quick to point out that they did not wish to overturn the entire post-war order, an outlook which really set them apart from the political right. It's therefore clear that the Republican version of a Greater Germany and territorial revisionism were very different from those of the political right. Not only did Republicans envision a democratic basis of this greater Germany, but they also sought peaceful means to achieve it. As Walter Kolb, a co-founder of the Reichsbanner and the head of the Republican student cartel, declared at a 1926 Republican rally in Vienna, quote, "The Großdeutschland of the Nazis will never be our Großdeutschland. We will wage the fiercest fight against whomever wants a Germany that should prove to be dangerous to world peace. However, we welcome fighters who want to create a Großdeutsch free and social republic with us," end quote. This statement, I think, really serves as an eloquent reminder that there were multiple understandings of Germanists during the Weimar era. Republicans went to great lengths to distinguish what they called their großdeutsch nationalism from what they labeled as right-wing all-Deutsch or pan-German nationalism and revisionism, which they characterized as violent and imperialist. While Republicans did limit their territorial revisionism to the Austro-German border, they did have a much more expansive understanding of the boundaries of nationhood than their conservative and right-wing opponents. So what I'd like to do now is shift our attention to how Republicans understood the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion in a Großdeutsch nation. And to do so, I'm going to focus on a couple of the groups most attacked by the political right: socialists and Jews. So let's start with socialists. Since the imperial era, the political right had contended that socialists were nationally suspect due to their internationalist outlook and connections. Socialists, however, refuted this claim, arguing that their dedication to the international community and working classes did not undermine their dedication to a German nation. To substantiate this argument, they insisted that the founders of their movement had long-standing connections to the Großdeutsch idea. And in this regard, they cited a host of famed social democratic leaders and socialist thinkers, including everyone from Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, August Bebel, Wilhelm Liebknecht, and Ferdinand Lassalle. For instance, in their support for a pro-Anschluss resolution in 1925, the socialists in the Krem City Council in Austria explained, quote, "Above all, the Social Democrats," and they put Bebel in parentheses, "were always Großdeutsch, and as a result, always strove for the unification of all German tribes in a Reich," end quote. So, similar to the Republican historical narratives, socialists hope to lend themselves national legitimacy by emphasizing that German socialism from its birth had been connected to the movement to create a greater Germany. In addition to creating these historical narratives, socialists from both countries insisted that national loyalties and the desire for international brotherhood were also, in fact, compatible. At a gathering of socialist paramilitary groups from across Europe in 1926, Otto Bauer, the leader of the left wing of the Austrian Social Democrats, who was of course also Jewish, explained, quote, "If we say Anschluss with Germany, we mean the right to self-determination for all peoples. We mean a free and united German people within the great community of free and unified peoples," end quote. For socialists, the love of the German folk and the desire for its right to national self-determination went hand in hand with the desire to see all peoples, at least in Europe, free. Now, even more striking was the inclusion of Jews in the Republican conception of nationhood. Whereas the political right excluded socialists for changeable political beliefs, it excluded Jews from the national community based on supposedly immutable racial characteristics. The multiple statements from Jewish figures about the Großdeutsch and Anschluss ideas that I've mentioned thus far show that Jews involved in the Republican parties adamantly contested this definition of a German national community. Jews were active participants in the Anschluss movement and the creation of the discourse about Großdeutsch nationalism. In fact, a number of Jews or individuals from Jewish backgrounds served on the executive committee of the Österreichisch-Deutscher Volksbund, or the Austro-German People's League, which was the most prominent Anschluss organization of the Weimar period. And unlike many nationalist organizations of the day, there were no so-called Aryan paragraphs precluding Jewish membership. And here, I know it's a lot of text, which you're not supposed to do on a PowerPoint, but I wanted to show you the range of Jewish members or people from Jewish backgrounds that were listed in either the executive committee or corporate list of the Österreichisch-Deutsche Volksbund. And you notice you have people that are from the political field, cultural field. You'll notice even on the corporate list in Austria was the whole Jewish community of Salzburg. Okay, I'll give everyone just a minute to look at that, and then I will continue just so you can see some of the names there and their positions. Okay, so the ability of Jews to join this organization and be highly visible in it was due to the fact that Republicans served as leaders of the Volksbund, especially on the German side of the organization. And these Republican leaders in the Volksbund made clear, quote, an attempt to bring about anti-Semitic divisions in the Volksbund's ranks would be nipped in the bud at a moment's notice, end quote. Indeed, the Republican associations as a whole also publicly declared their opposition to the anti-Semitic notions of nationhood and ensured that Jews were visible. In the first issue, for instance, of its eponymous publication, the Reichsbanner decried what it called, quote unquote, stupid anti-Semitism. Consequently, as the opening anecdote illustrated, the Reichsbanner ensured that not only Julius Deutsch, but also Ludwig Haas, who again was a leading figure in the Central Association of German Citizens of the Jewish Faith, had prominent speaking roles at the 1925 anniversary of the organization. And we can thus see that Republicans from a Jewish background felt themselves to be German, and significantly, so too did their non-Jewish counterparts in the Republican movement. However, I do want to point out that this inclusion of Jews in a German national community was not on the basis of civic nationalism. So Republicans, both Jews and non-Jews alike, clearly believed in a nation that transcended state borders. For Republicans, citizenship was therefore not the main criteria for being a part of a German national community. So this raises the question of how did Republicans explain the basis of this cross-border German national community? And they really did so in a variety of ways. So some Republicans claim that it was simply a matter of one's choice to be German. Others pointed to the existence of a common language and culture that extended beyond state borders. Yet many Republicans, including those from Jewish backgrounds, also used language that scholars have often labeled as folkish, that is, representative of ethnic, racist, anti-Semitic, and exclusionary nationalism. For example, in a speech during a celebration of the Weimar Constitution in 1924, Karl Petersen, who was a member of the German Democratic Party, the mayor of Hamburg, and also had one Jewish parent, explained that Austrians and Germans were one nation because of the, quote, commonality of language, nature, and blood, end quote. Likewise, Haas, in expressing his support for an Anschluss at the Reichsbanner celebration that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, referred to, quote, our German tribal brothers in Austria, end quote. Now, while this language of blood and tribe was prevalent in Republican speeches and articles about this cross-border national community, it's really important to recognize that the use of these terms in the Weimar era was not fully predicated on the racist ideas of Blut und Boden, or blood and soil. In discussing a geographically expansive national community, Republicans repeatedly eschewed a folkish understanding of Germanness. Thus, in a pamphlet to celebrate the Weimar Constitution, Gustav Radbruch, a German socialist and legal theorist, expressed his desire for, quote unquote, our tribal brothers in Austria to join the Reich, while also explaining that individuals from both Jewish and immigrant backgrounds were national comrades. He thus declared, quote, Germans of different descent, Abstammung, are nonetheless Germans of the same national spirit and worth, with an exclamation point at the end quote. He, like other Republicans, could simultaneously recognize the existence of a großdeutsch nation and the inclusion of Jews and even immigrants within it because terms such as tribe and blood were still flexible in the Weimar era. And as historian Till von Roden has shown, the concept of tribe or Stamm enabled Jews and other minorities to emphasize both their particularities and their membership in a German folk. Such a stance should perhaps not be surprising, as the preamble of the Weimar Constitution pronounced that the German folk was united in its tribes, as you can see here, einig in seinen Stämmen. Republicans therefore used ethnic ideas like tribe in a more inclusive way than the political right, and did so in their efforts to actually instill democratic values in the population at large. We should therefore not assume that the use of these terms is an automatic indicator of folkish or anti-Semitic sentiments. This, of course, is not to say that Republicans entirely omitted unsavory elements from their version of nationalism. Although they opposed racial anti-Semitism, some Republicans did embrace racist attitude towards people of color. And as scholar Fatima El-Tayeb has illustrated, some members of the German Social Democrats, the Center Party, and the left liberals harbored racist attitudes towards Black people, both in Imperial Germany and in the Weimar Republic. And thus, for instance, we can see that some members of the Weimar coalition parties participated in the extremely racist campaign against the French use of colonial soldiers in the Rhineland after the First World War. So we can see that there are some limits to Republicans' tolerance, which I think shows the pervasiveness of anti-Black racism in defining Germanness in the early 20th century. But on the whole, Republican nationalism was still qualitatively different from the nationalisms of the political right. Okay, now that I've looked at the discursive aspects of Republican nationalism, I want to emphasize that Republicans were not simply paying lip service to these ideas. Rather, their genuine belief in großdeutsch nationalism and the desire to unite Germany and Austria were powerful incentives to action. Republicans of all ranks invested a great deal of time and effort into making the abstract idea of a großdeutsch nation concrete. And one strategy that Republicans pursued was to carry out symbolic acts to embody the idea of a großdeutsch national community. So in Germany, for instance, individual Reichsbanner chapters would hold großdeutsch celebrations from time to time. For example, the branches in Ulm-Silesia and in Gandersheim, Lower Saxony, each dedicated their flag dedication ceremonies as quote unquote großdeutsch days. And I think these instances also show that the großdeutsch idea was not just confined to the organization's leaders in major cities. And to take an example from Austria, the Socialist Party named one of Red Vienna's famous housing projects after Friedrich Ebert. And you can see the photos from its opening from the Arbeiterzeitung there. Unless there was any doubt that this gesture was purely due to socialist reasons, the Arbeiterzeitung explained that the Friedrich Ebert Hof, quote, was above all else a visible symbol of the will to Anschluss by the overwhelming majority of the folk, end quote. And here you can see the headline about the opening of the Eberthof, and you'll see that it says that it's also a rally for Anschluss there. Additionally, as I have just mentioned, Republicans served in the largest Anschluss organization of the Weimar era, the Österreichisch-Deutscher Volksbund, or the Austro-German People's League. They were so devoted to the cause that they not only held leadership roles in the organization, but also served alongside their political foes. And this organization was really quite a strange amalgam in the Weimar era. It included the supporters and opponents of democracy, Jews and anti-Semites, Catholics and Protestants, workers and members of the bourgeoisie. Now, the countervailing forces involved in the association were typified by the two figures serving in the Volksbund leadership. So the chairman of the German side of the association was Paul Löbe, again, social democrat, while the head of the Austrian branch of the organization was Hermann Neubacher, who was a radical German nationalist that would become mayor of Vienna following the Nazi-led Anschluss in 1938. And here you can see an image of them gathered. They're marked with the X, Paul Löbe with 1, Neubacher with 2. And this is on the way of the German delegation to Vienna. They're being greeted in Passau by Neubacher there. Now, the Volksbund members who hailed from the Weimar coalition parties and the Austrian Social Democrats participated in the organization due not only to their devotion to the Anschluss idea, but also to their Republican version of this idea. Thus, at rallies and in the publications of the Volksbund, Republicans explicitly stated that an Anschluss would happen on the basis of the Weimar Constitution and would lead to a greater German republic, much to the dismay, I should point out, of conservative and right-wing radicals, both within the organization and outside of it. Thus, for instance, during the visit of the Volksbund members from the Reich to Vienna in 1925, Paul Speiser of the Austrian Socialist talked about his desire to see, quote, the entire free German folk in a free republic, end quote. On other occasions, the Volksbund would even hold joint celebrations with the Reichsbanner in Germany. And here you can see an illustration of this. We have flag groups from both the Reichsbanner and the Volksbund gathering in Meerbeck, Germany. Now, beyond symbolic acts and participation in this Anschluss organizations, Republicans also invested a great deal of time and resources to travel across the border to visit one another in order to make the großdeutsch idea tangible, as the opening anecdote illustrated. The Republican cross-border journeys began when the Reichsbanner wanted to stage what it called, quote, a powerful demonstration for the Republican and großdeutsch ideas, end quote, at its 1924 celebration for the Weimar Constitution. Consequently, the Reichsbanner executives asked the Republikanischer Schutzbund, so again, that's the Austrian socialist paramilitary group, to send representatives, which the Schutzbund did. And from this point on, the Reichsbanner and Schutzbund would attend various celebrations of one another. Reporters from a variety of newspapers, ranging from the New York Times to the Center Party affiliated Germania, remarked that this cross-border exchange marked a highlight of these celebrations. Now, while on some occasions only a prominent speaker attended these transborder festivities, in other cases, rank and file members of these organizations also made the journey. And to give just a few examples, 500 members of the Schutzbund were among the 120,000 people celebrating the Reichsbanner's second anniversary in Hamburg in 1926. And here we can see on the cover of the illustrated Reichsbanner newspaper, this is the Schutzbund stopping in Magdeburg, either on its way to or from that celebration in Hamburg, and you can see the large crowds gathered there. And to give another example, on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the Weimar Constitution in 1929, 1,500 members of the Schutzbund traveled to Berlin. And here you can see on the spread, there's over 150,000 people celebrating, really large and enthusiastic crowds. And in the bottom right corner here in the circle, that is the representatives from the Schutzbund marching in the parade. And their banner says Deutsch Österreich on it, which was, of course, the banned name for the country. So the Allies would not allow Austria to call itself that after the First World War. Now, Reichsbanner members also traveled to Austria. Such instances included over 4,000 members of the Reichsbanner attending a workers' gymnastic and sport festival in Vienna in 1926. And here we can see this is the Reichsbanner marching on the Ringstrasse in Vienna. And here they are in a parade for this workers' sport festival. And you'll notice the Reichsbanner calls it Großdeutschland, Greater Germany. And then in another instance, 105 Reichsbanner members attended an Anschluss rally that the Schutzbund organized at that Friedrich Eberthof in 1929. And these are actually stills from a little video clip of the rally being held in the Eberthof. And as you will notice, the title of the video is Anschluss Rally in Eberthof. Moreover, I'd like to point out that enthusiasm for the Republican großdeutsch idea was not simply confined to the members of the Schutzbund and Reichsbanner that were making these cross-border journeys. In every one of these visits, observers described the excitement among local populations caused by the presence of Austrians in Germany and Germans in Austria. Press coverage of these events mentioned that the mere appearance of these groups in the neighboring country prompted unending applause and densely packed crowds. For example, during the Reichsbanner's second anniversary celebrations in Hamburg, thousands of men and women turned up to witness the arrival of the Schutzbund despite pouring rain. And similar scenes played out during the Reichsbanner's travels to Austria. Hence, when the Reichsbanner was leaving Vienna following the 1926 Sport Festival, spontaneous Anschluss rallies occurred. So, for instance, despite only a short notice being published in the Arbeiterzeitung about the Reichsbanner's departure, thousands of men and women gathered to see them off. Reports say that the Viennese gave Reichsbanner men flowers and offered to carry their luggage and cheered loudly for everything from socialism to Germany to the Republic and to an Anschluss. And such large crowds had gathered that the Schutzbund had to close access to the train station. Now, the cross-border journeys of Republican organizations therefore served a number of purposes. Through them, these groups could demonstrate the porousness of a border that they hoped would one day be a race. The trips also served as a way to educate rank and file Republicans that Germans and Austrians belonged to the same folk and were engaged in a shared struggle for democracy. Moreover, they demonstrated to skeptics and opponents of the Republicans that Republicans did indeed possess strong national convictions and that the republics had popular support throughout German-speaking Central Europe. Now, while großdeutsch nationalism and an Anschluss were central to Republicans' efforts to defend democracy and demonstrate their national credentials, I do want to point out that these ideas were part of an even more geographically expansive nationalism on the part of Republicans. My current research project examines how the ideas of a German diaspora and so-called Germans abroad, or Auslandsdeutsche, influenced the heated debates about politics and nationhood in the Weimar Republic. While the idea of so-called Germans abroad had emerged in the 19th century as a way to deal with the national anxieties caused by global migration, this notion took on renewed importance following Germany's defeat in the Great War. Many German speakers viewed these so-called Germans abroad as a way both to restore Germany's influence around the world and to revitalize a German nation. Moreover, because the national idea became of supreme importance in both domestic and international politics after the war, German politicians tried to show that they had the support of all Germans, regardless of where they lived. Thus, the notion of a German diaspora influenced the debates about political legitimacy in the Weimar Republic. Now, I'm still conducting my research for this project, but I'm finding that Weimar political symbols and organizations became new ways that Germans living abroad and in the Reich reimagined their connections to one another in this time of great upheaval. After all, defeat in the revolution undermined the symbols that had been so important in first cementing the idea of a German diaspora in the imperial era. So pride in the rise of a strong German state, portraits of the Kaiser and Bismarck, and the black, white, red flag of imperial Germany. Now, for the German migrants who participated in Weimar politics, they hoped to display their continued membership in a German nation by getting involved in the most urgent political debates occurring in Germany. By sending in petitions about political issues in the Reich, or by joining a Weimar-era political organization, such as the Stahlhelm, the Nazi Party, or the Reichsbanner, they were trying to make a direct connection with a Germany that had been radically transformed by the war, while simultaneously either rejecting or supporting Germany's new political basis. Meanwhile, political figures in the Reich hoped to show that these so-called Germans abroad supported their political position as a way to portray themselves as the rightful leaders of a German folk. Now, conservatives in the radical right certainly tried to make it seem as though all Germans abroad were hostile to the changing government in Germany after 1918. However, what I'm doing is I'm looking at how Republicans contested these claims as well. For instance, in the contentious debate over the change to Germany's official colors from the black, white, red flag of Imperial Germany to the black, red, gold flag of the Weimar Republic, the political right often declared that a German diaspora would be lost unless the imperial colors were restored. They argued that during the Second Reich, the black, white, red flag had become an emblem of Germany's global empire, trade, and power, and thereby a symbol of pride that had kept German immigrants connected to Germany. To support their argument, the political right in Germany pointed to numerous petitions and letters from so-called Germans abroad demanding a return to the imperial tricolor. However, Republicans in Germany refuted the notion that so-called Germans abroad only wanted a return to the imperial colors and a monarchy in general. In a Reichstag debate on the matter, Rudolf Breitscheid, a leading social democrat, emphasized that German workers and tradespeople overseas were, quote, equally as good pioneers of Germandom abroad, end quote, and that they supported the Republican flag. As a way to prove this point, representatives from the Weimar coalition parties also quoted from letters from these so-called Germans abroad who actually supported the Republic's flag. Moreover, Republicans in the Reich highlighted the existence of Republican groups abroad to further legitimize Weimar democracy. German speakers in places as varied as Portugal, the United States, Bulgaria, the Netherlands, and Argentina, for instance, created outposts of the Reichsbanner. Additionally, independent German Republican associations popped up in places like Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, the United States, and Lithuania. So-called Germans abroad created these groups both as a way to maintain their connection to a Germany that had been radically altered after the war and to educate their fellow Germans about the new Republican state and thereby win its supporters. To do so, as you can see here, they put out their own publications, distributed Reichsbanner newspapers from Germany, created libraries, held celebrations for the Weimar Constitution, organized sporting clubs, held lectures, went on field trips, and marched in German Day celebrations with the black, red, gold flag. And so here, this newspaper, Schwarz-Rot-Gold, this is actually published by the Reichsbanner in Chicago, and you'll notice that they are celebrating Constitution Day here, and this is actually a contingent from the Chicago Reichsbanner marching in the Constitution Day parade in Berlin. And then this image over here is from the Deutsche Republikanische Vereinigung in Rio de Janeiro. So the German Republican Association in Rio. And again, you notice that they are celebrating the Constitution Day and the colors black, red, gold. Now, in these publications and on these occasions, these Republicans abroad related the same 19th century historical and großdeutsch narratives that I mentioned earlier in the talk. They also, just like Republicans in Germany and Austria, argued that the Weimar Republic was the best kind of state for the German people because the members of the nation were the source of the state's power. As the Association of German Republicans in Mexico explained, quote, what unites us is the Republican and democratic ideal, the recognition that the folk is itself the creator and source of its government, end quote. For these German Republicans in Mexico, as for German Republicans everywhere, there was no conflict between their political views and their national sentiments. Likewise, Republicans back in the Reich pointed to their supporters abroad to refute the political right's assertion that they were un-German. In one of its columns on the activities of the Republican associations overseas, the Reichsbanner Journal concluded, quote, all of these reports show that the arguments of the political rights press about the Germans abroad only standing behind the monarchist idea and the black, white, red imperial flag are nothing more than the deception of the public opinion in Germany, end quote. In demonstrating its concern for Germans abroad and for the growth of the Republican movement among them, the Reichsbanner sought to demonstrate both its national convictions and respected position among a globally expansive German nation. Additionally, Republicans overseas decried an anti-Semitic understanding of Germanness when explaining the basis of a German diaspora, just as Republicans in Germany and Austria had done when explaining the basis of a großdeutsch nation. In contrast to the Stahlhelm and Nazi chapters abroad, Republican groups did not have anti-Semitic restrictions on membership. For example, the statutes of the German Republican Association for the La Plata states explain that, quote unquote, all German-speaking women and men could join the group. Furthermore, the Reichsbanner chapters abroad followed the lead of the organization in Germany and rejected anti-Semitism. The head of the Reichsbanner in Chicago thus criticized the Nazis' attacks on Jews in April of 1933, saying, quote, a blemish which will persist for generations is the abominable race war. The fact remains unnoticed in Nazi Germany that the German Jews have made outstanding contributions to German culture and science, that 12,000 German Jews gave their lives in the war, exclamation point. Now, as the date of this statement shows, April 1933, the existence of the Reichsbanner abroad allowed it to continue promoting a Republican form of German nationalism, even after the Nazis had banned the organization and these ideas in Germany. Republicans were therefore active participants alongside groups like the Nazis and Stahlhelm in the efforts to redefine a German diaspora in the wake of the momentous changes caused by the war. So-called Germans abroad were therefore not all fifth columnists in waiting. So to conclude, Republicans' cross-border partnerships illustrate that the belief in a geographically expansive national community was not solely the project of the political right. Republicans in Germany, Austria, and beyond worked hard to frame the democratic republics as part of a German national tradition. Furthermore, the fact that Republicans embraced an Anschluss and the notion of a German diaspora also complicates our notions of German nationalism in this era. And here I should really speak about nationalisms, plural, as there was no singular form of German nationalism at the time. Just because people used ethnic terms to explain why a German nation extended across state borders did not mean that they necessarily embraced folkish nationalism. My work is therefore trying to contribute to a growing body of scholarship that moves beyond the binary categorizations of supposedly good civic and Western nationalism and supposedly bad ethnic and German nationalism. I'm also seeking, especially in my current project, to contribute to scholarly literatures that seek to look beyond the borders of the nation state in order to explore what Glenn Penny and Stefan Rinke have called the global production of Germanness. Moreover, this cross-border approach can challenge some common notions about politics in this era. In the historiography on the First Austrian Republic, scholars often claim that the demands for an Anschluss undermined democratic and republican forms of governance in interwar Austria. However, if we look at Republicans' ideas about Anschluss, it is clear that they made these demands for an Austro-German union in an effort to actually bolster the new post-war political system. In terms of the literature on the Weimar Republic, this cross-border approach contributes to a growing scholarship that emphasizes the Weimar Republic was not a so-called republic without Republicans and was not doomed to fail. By looking at the connections between Republicans in the Weimar Republic, the First Austrian Republic, and even German communities abroad, we can see that the triumph of Nazi ideas about nationalism and politics was not inevitable. Thank you. I guess I can take questions now. So if there's any questions, I've been told you can put them in the chat or voice
Oh,
them.
hello. Sorry, I'm back. I couldn't unmute myself there. Yes, that just a sort of eerie silence then, wasn't it? So we were saying we can't have actual applause on Zoom, but I see some people are doing virtual applause, which is almost as good, I suppose. Yes, thank you, Erin, for such a rich presentation, and the sources to accompany it were fantastic as well. So there's a lot to think about. And I'm sure people will have questions. If you have questions, feel free either to type them in the chat. Erin can read and respond to them. Or if you prefer to sort of raise your hand in a virtual way, hopefully you know how to do that, and we can come to you and you can speak your question out. So whichever you prefer. I see Bob Goldsmith has his hand raised. So if you'd like to go first, Bob.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, I've been trying to look in more depth at the politics of the liberal German Jewish community in Berlin within the later years of the Weimar Republic, and finding it an endlessly disturbing process in a way, because a lot of the natural assumptions one makes don't necessarily fit the evidence. And that's the underlying wish to be Jews, Germans of the Jewish faith meant a greater engagement in things that might initially seem to us, looking back, uncomfortable, and therefore it makes it endlessly fascinating in its ambiguities. One thing you talked about was both, and I hope these are the right names, Julian Deutsch and Ludwig Haas, and it was either 1925 or 26, I think it was 26, being such advocates of this wider Deutsch idea. And I'm just wondering whether there's anything written by them. Maybe this is something I need to look into, and as part of what I'm trying to address, as to why they were such strong advocates, because there are various reasons why that could be. One, the wish to very much assimilate and become part of the mainstream in an active, responsible, civic manner of the German political nation. It could also be an awareness that in being part of a wider entity than one's country alone, as had been the case with the now past Habsburg Empire, gave a sense of feeling a little safer. But it's an interesting one as to what you talked a lot about it, but not why. And I'm also interested to know whether, and again, this is something maybe I should look at, whether there was any opposition to that within the Jewish politics, because there's not one Jewish community, and as you increasingly as that sort of whole political debate, whether that was contested. Interesting area to look into, and I wonder whether you'd had a chance to think about it.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you so much for your question. I'll look forward to your work on the topic of the liberal Jewish community in Berlin and late Weimar. Okay, so you're right. Jews are not one singular group in this period. And in my book, I do talk about how there is opposition, especially like I came across a Zionist newspaper that criticizes them for going around and talking a lot about großdeutsch nationalism and Anschluss, for instance. So you're right. There's not a unified Jewish community. Also, and I'm trying to remember the scholar's first name, but Nielsen, I think, is the last name, has written on a different group of Jews who joined the VDA, right, the Verein für das Deutschtum im Ausland in the Weimar era, and found really interesting, I think it's Philip Nilsson, I'll have to double check, found really interesting correspondence among kind of Jewish figures who I think are more conservative in politics and the VDA, right, the Association for Germandom Abroad. In terms of Deutsch and Haas, I mean, you know, Haas is a member of the Zentralverein, and of course the Zentralverein, right, one of its big thing is they're proud to be Germans, right? They're German citizens of Jewish faith, right? So Judaism was simply a religion, but in terms of kind of national thinking and pride, they're proud to be German. And then in Deutsch's case, it's not entirely clear, to be honest. I have not found, here's why I'm proud to be German, but I mean, I have so many speeches and articles from him during the Weimar era, in which he's constantly talking about Anschluss. He's constantly talking about this großdeutsch community, both in these cross-border Republican events between the Schutzbund and the Reichsbanner, but also between purely social cross-border socialist events. So between the German Socialist Party and the Austrian Socialist Party. I did not have time to go into it in the talk, but they also stage cross-border celebrations or go and attend each other's election rallies. And they also use Anschluss as kind of a framing motif in those instances as well.
Right. Yeah, please feel free to type your questions in the chat, in which case I will read them out actually for the benefit of those listening later. If anybody, I'm trying to see any more virtual hands if any are raised. I think if you raise them, you go to the top actually. So in the meantime, Michael, you have a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for your paper. I'm not an expert on the Weimar Republic by any means, but I just wanted to ask you about what you told us about the kind of historical reference points which these Republican großdeutsch thinkers kind of established. You pointed to, of course, to the Frankfurt Parliament and 1848. But did they go kind of further back, let's say, to the Holy Roman Empire or to the Deutsche Bund or so, to establish a kind of a großdeutsch precedent for what they were trying to create? And the other question would be, I'm kind of interested in the relationship between the großdeutsch ideas of the 19th century and what you were talking about. So in a way, is there continuity or is there discontinuity? Were these ideas completely refashioned during the Weimar Republic? And one aspect would be that I think in the 19th century, quite a few kind of Catholic historians were championing großdeutsch ideas. So is there still kind of a strong Catholic element within these movements, or has this kind of disappeared or been dissolved in a way? Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for those questions. So in these historical narratives, which I've explored and some other historians have explored as well, what we see is that they're really trying to show that the German national movement, right, in its birth is linked to the kind of political reform. And so they're really only going into like the 19th century, right? So like the wars of liberation against Napoleon comes up, Wartburg Festival, Hambach Festival. Again, 1848 is a really, really big one for them. And so that's really the emphasis in those historical narratives that Republicans are laying out. So not kind of the Holy Roman Empire or anything that wouldn't have what they see as like democratic or, you know, democratic politics or political reform associated with it, right? Because they're trying to say that democracy is a German national tradition, right? To undercut the arguments of the political right. Now, in terms of kind of the continuity in großdeutsch ideas, the Catholic element. So I really like Brian Vick's book that is on the Frankfurt Parliament, and it looks at the debates and ideas about kind of not just the constitution, but really ideas about inclusion and exclusion, right, in terms of conceptualizing the nation at the time. And I do think they're picking up on some of these ideas, but I don't think they're picking up on the ideas you're talking about in the Catholic sense. Now, the Catholic Center Party does participate, or the left wing, let me point that out. The left wing of the Catholic Center Party does participate in this kind of Republican großdeutsch Anschluss movement and discourse, because they're members of the Reichsbanner, but there's actually lots of tensions created by the fact that the Reichsbanner is paired with a purely socialist organization in Austria, because when the Austrians come, they carry red flags. They say stuff in favor of socialism, and it does create some tensions within the Reichsbanner, and the political right at the time actually picks up on that and tries to divide Center Party members from the Reichsbanner, although it's not ultimately successful in doing so. But I haven't even seen the members of the Catholic Center Party necessarily appealing to a specifically Catholic idea. They talk more about, oh, we want a großdeutsch social republic of the future that obviously would include Catholics and Protestants and Jews. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I have a question if oh, I think one has come through, but I'll ask mine anyway. Yeah, I mean it's such an array of material that you've gathered together, and I'm sure that's just the tip of the iceberg. And I'm just curious sort of how that's distributed. I mean, is it in, Berlin, Vienna? Is it regionally distributed? What, which archives did you go to?
Yeah. So when I was doing the research for what started as my dissertation, and then more research to transform it into a book, I mean, I did do a lot of research in Berlin and Vienna at places like the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, in Vienna, the Staatsarchiv there, as well as the Wien Bibliothek, which actually has great resources if you ever need newspaper clipping collections for this period. Wien Bibliothek has great collections, I have to say. I also did in Berlin the Politisches Archiv des Auswärtigen Amts, looked at their collections on relations between Germany and Austria. They also had some files on the Volksbund. In Austria, I also did research in Salzburg and in Graz to try to get a regional view of what was going on. I will say it was challenging because they didn't always, like, even in the Staatsarchiv in Vienna, stuff wasn't necessarily cataloged. It may be now because I did this research mostly in 2005-06. But they'd have to pull out the ledger for each ministry for every year, and I'd have to guess like what keyword they might record documents under. The Bundeskanzler files, like on the national anthem debate and on national holidays in Austria, had been skartiert, had been destroyed after the Second World War to make space for new materials. I also did research at the Archiv der Sozialdemokratie in Bonn, as well as, oh my gosh, I'm gonna forget the name because it's been a while. It's been like 10 years since I've been there. But there's an archive for the history of the working class movement. I can't remember exactly, in Vienna, and I did research there, and they had some really interesting correspondence from Deutsch and the Schutzbund. For instance, one letter I found where the Schutzbund, so the Reichsbanner writes to Deutsch because Deutsch has participated in this, celebration, right, for the first anniversary of the Reichsbanner, and then German newspapers are writing anti-Semitic attacks about Deutsch participating in this event. And the Reichsbanner actually writes to Deutsch and says, do you want us to bring a lawsuit, right, for like defamation, basically, for these anti-Semitic attacks? And Deutsch says, no, just leave it alone. But there was all sorts of interesting correspondence there. So I think in a range of archives and libraries in Germany and Austria.
Yeah. Wow. It does sound like quite a
Yeah.
range. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just read out the question that's come in the chat. I'm currently writing a dissertation on Julius Brauenthal. I'm trying to situate him within Central Europe's transition away from a pre-1789 multinational monarchical order to a modern order of more exclusionary forms of egalitarianism. I'm wondering how to prove, in inverted commas, Brauenthal's importance for a fellowship application, how to answer the so what question within this macro problematic of Jews continuing to have to rely on aristocratic elites while being structurally aligned with the left. Wow, okay.
Oh, wow.
We'll have a
This is
shot
a
at
really interesting,
that.
really interesting project, Jenny. And oh, yeah, that is a really good question. I always feel like that's always the hardest part when you're doing your research, is answering that so what question, right? And figuring out what that is. And oftentimes it'll come once you get further into your into your writing, to be honest, right? I mean, my project took a lot of twists and turns before I finally got to what the main kind of the main argument I ended up making, and the so what question. And this is a really, because my people aren't dealing with aristocratic elites at all, right? So they're full-fledged Republicans. But I would recommend, and I don't know if it's coming out later this year or early next year, which I know isn't in time for your fellowship application, but James McSpadden is publishing a book that's looking at kind of the relationship between the kind of social relations between parliamentarians in a number of countries: Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, and I think Czechoslovakia were the main ones. And he does deal some with like the aristocratic elites and how, so his work may be very useful for you in figuring out the importance of kind of the social life of these people. So he writes, for instance, I was a reviewer of the manuscript, so I know the argument of the book. But he's writing about like the importance of, behind closed doors interactions. So dinners associating with one another at balls that are being held at the time, right? And how that can create all sorts of kind of cross-party, cross-class interactions that you don't think of as normal in the political context of the era. So you may want to write to him. He's at the University of Nevada, Reno. And again, his book will be coming out. I'm excited for it to appear.
Excellent. That was very helpful.
Oh, I see a physical hand, Jonathan, right?
Thank you so much for this.
Jenny.
Thank you so much for this. Sorry, so Brauenthal, he had to escape the United Kingdom. And he had to, he managed to get his mother-in-law, wife, and son a British visa in 1940 by listing, among other references, an aristocratic governor of Kenya. And this sort of, for me, this is sort of the fundamental paradox and problem of European Jewish history. Why should Brauenthal not have been able to, why in 1939 had the political system so disastrously deteriorated that these Republican like the Schutzbund, Brauenthal was imprisoned in the Dollfuss Putsch. I think he was talking to Schutzbund members who like wanted a rebellion. In jail in 1934, he had to escape Austria in 1935 with help from Hans von Hammerstein-Eckwald, the state secretary. And he, as I was saying, he assembled this aristocratic list, including, to get this visa in 1939 to 1940. These visas, he was successful. Osbert Peake, I think the British, in the British, the British Foreign Ministry, who was later made an earl, accepted that application. I mean, this is a really sort of, really sort of personal, like pre-1789, sort of appeal that Brown to make. And it sort of, I mean, it fascinates me because, Brownthal was such a passionate, unlike most Habsburg, unlike, the Wittgensteins, etc., he was so passionately anti-Habsburg, and he was so socialist. And so, by traveling to Britain in 1939, he had to go back before 1789.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And again, I think James McSpadden's work will be helpful because he's looking at the importance of these social interactions, right, that transcend kind of traditional political or class cleavages. And in fact, he has a journal article on it's on Brüning and Hilferding. Brüning actually apparently tried to really help Hilferding to escape the grasp of the Nazis, ultimately was not successful in doing so. So I'd really recommend looking at his work. I think it would help you to position and contextualize your work, and it might give you a new angle to research, is really looking at those personal interactions kind of behind closed doors, not on the floor of the Nationalrat or, whatever, can help you better understand that.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
I can't
of course. Okay, I think Jonathan Wright had a question.
Sure.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. I thought your lecture was extremely valuable, and it's certainly convincing that Republicans were also nationalists. I mean, I think that's undeniable. And someone like Paul Löber is a perfect example right the way through. I wanted to tease you a bit, though, with the difficult situations where there is a conflict of German nationalism and other nationalisms. For instance, the Polish frontier. I mean, you mentioned Upper Silesia, and you also mentioned the use of black troops in the Rhine, in the Ruhr. But I mean, there you could say that goes on, right up to 1930. There are French troops, one League power occupying the territory of another League power. Now, how do you react as a Republican nationalist, believing in the League of Nations, when you're faced with such a fact? Or indeed the veto on the Austro-German customs union. I think, so, I mean, can you remain a good German nationalist and an internationalist when Germany is so obviously, in some sense, discriminated against?
Okay. Yeah, great. great and complex question there. I will say, in the materials I have examined, I have not really seen criticism of the League of Nations. What I did come across, for instance, is criticism of the French for occupying areas like the Rhine and the Ruhr, right? Criticism, of course, of Mussolini over South Tyrol. And, it's really interesting. So when they're talking about these so-called, or kind of Germans that are under foreign control, again, they're very quick to say, hey, we're not looking to take these areas over, but we care about the German rights in these areas. And they often frame the abuse of German rights in these areas as a result of illiberal or fascist politics, right? So they say, oh, what the French are doing here, this is an example of French imperialism. What Mussolini's doing to the German speakers in South Tyrol is an example of Italian fascism, right? But they don't come out and criticize the League itself, right, over those particular issues. Instead, they're kind of picking up on who's controlling that area and finding a way to position it as, oh, this is an example of imperialism, fascism, illiberal politics in some sort of way. Luba, I think he's such an interesting figure, and I really wish someone would write a full biography on him. I think there's only a biography on him up to 1918, and I think a lot of his personal papers were destroyed in the bombings of Berlin during the Second World War, but I still think he's a really fascinating guy. He, for instance, he goes around, he gives speeches, because he's going from, like, traveling for Volksbund, right, Austro-German People's League events, to socialist events, to more kind of like international events. And I have this quote from him where he says, oh, like, I'm a good German nationalist, that's why I'm at the Volksbund event, but next I'm going to some like socialist event and, you know, league event, whatever the case may be. He sees them all as reconcilable. And in his post-war memoir, he talks about how like his type of nationalism, his type of pride in being German has nothing to do with like the bullish nationalism of the Nazis. So they're making these kinds of distinctions. And other figures, Wilhelm Heile was he was a DDP member, highly involved in the Volksbund, but also in pan-European movements at the time. They see all of these things as fitting together, right? So they may criticize an individual country, but not the actual international post-war structures.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. If anyone else has a question, I would just jump in now or type it in the chat. But if not, and it's always difficult to determine these things, I will say thank you again to Professor Erin Hochman for a really fantastic talk this evening that's really raised some interesting questions and revised our conventional interpretation of nationalism in this period. So let's thank her again with whatever applause you can sort of muster. As we are online this evening, unfortunately, there is no drinks reception, but we would have had one otherwise. So yes, thank you again for your time this evening. Thanks for your attention, and we hope to see you again at another of our lectures, which you can find out about on our website. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day, rest of your evening. Bye from me.